Good evening and welcome to TDM Talk Show. Recent air quality readings have sounded the alarm over air pollution both in Macau and Hong Kong. This happens as pollutants from mainland China are trapped by the lack of airflow in both regions. To talk about environmental issues in the Pearl River Delta region, today with us we have Eric Tang. He's a researcher and professor at the Department of Science and Environmental Studies at the Hong Kong Institute of Education. Professor Eric Tang, thank you for joining us and welcome to the show.
You're welcome, Jose.
How bad is the situation and how to solve it, talking about air quality in Hong Kong and Macau?
Well, I think in Hong Kong, the air quality, I'll just say put it into a regional perspective. Compared to some rich Asian countries around Hong Kong, like Taipei or Seoul, we are comparable. But if you are comparing it to North America, Europe, we are actually well below the standards set by all these developed countries. So we have a long way to go, and I'm glad to say the Hong Kong Special Administration Region government is beginning to have a series of actions, short and long term, to try to remediate this issue. I wouldn't say solve, because to solve it would take a long time. And I think we are taking a series of steps, short and long term, to tackle this problem.
You mentioned a long time. Are we talking about 10, 20, 30 years?
Well, it depends on how well the policies go, because to solve this problem, obviously, it could be a combination of technologies and policies.
But we have bad practices from elsewhere, like from Europe, Canada, United States, or other countries, so perhaps there are some benchmarks.
Yeah, I think the main benchmark here is the air quality objectives. Now in Hong Kong, there has been a lot of debate on this, because the present air quality objective used in Hong Kong were established in 1987, and it hasn't been reviewed since. And the green groups and all the people who care about it were criticizing the government on not reviewing these air quality objectives, which is well below the WHO standards. And we are now in the stage of reviewing these air quality objectives, and we are looking at a possible review and a renewal of these air quality objectives in 2014 earliest. So that's the first thing we do. And I think the second issue is, because of all the environmental issues, I think human well-being is one of the main things we should consider.
You mentioned human well-being and not necessarily only public health. What is that?
Not necessarily, because if we look at health in a broader perspective, it will include mental and physical health. And I would mention one very simple thing is light pollution. People living under strong neon lights, they tend to have a lot of mental issues.
Many of our viewers are very familiar with that situation, especially in the Macau Peninsula.
That's why I'm saying well-being, and I think that would include the working environment, the living environment as well. So we are not just talking about the environmental quality, we're just talking about the people living in it, whether they are living comfortably in it, in terms of mental wellness and physical wellness.
So when dealing with this problem of air pollution, we have, or authorities will have to use both sticks and carrots. Would you single out a few?
Apart from this, you mean?
Yes, I mean incentives and also a punishment to those who do not comply with standards.
I think in Hong Kong and in other countries as a whole, it's a combination of approaches. The first thing is what you talked about, carrot and stick, which means the command and control measures, legislation, ordinances, and so on. And the second thing is based on voluntary and incentive-based strategies. And I'll give you some examples later on each of these. And then I think the third thing will be market-driven and economy-based, like polluters pay principle, and so on. In terms of the first thing, the command and control measures, like tightening the air pollution ordinances, raising the bar for industries, raising the bar for emission from vehicles, and that's one example of the control and command measures. And the second thing is incentive-based. Now, we are going to launch an initiative to try and remediate the roadside air pollution. That is, to phase out all the pre-Euro, Euro 1, Euro 2, and Euro 3 goods vehicles on the road. By 2016, we intend to remove all the pre-Euro, Euro 1, Euro 2 goods vehicles from the road, and by 2019, all pre-Euro 3 vehicles will not be on the road anymore. But of course, to go with that, that comes the incentive bit. The government will help these people to convert their vehicles into at least Euro 4 vehicles. And of course, that would take money. There's a lot of controversies involved in this case, mainly based on economic reasons, because if you're a truck owner, and you have to change your truck into a Euro 4, Euro 5 truck, that would take a lot of money. And the government will give you some money. Would that be enough? And he will be, for example, there's a truck driver that talks to me. He said, Eric, if I change my truck into Euro 6, then I would have to pay $30,000 a month, at least, to pay off the bank in order to change that. And he can't even make $30,000 a month by driving the thing. So that's one thing the government have to think about. They talk about rebates for these people. Would they be exempted and so on? With the third big polluters pay principle is another very, very important thing. And as you know, Jose, I think the main problem with environmental issue is people just take the environment as a public good, right? And then at the end of the day, somebody has to pay for the externalities. Then who pays for it? And obviously it's the polluters pays for it. That it wouldn't just go for air pollution. It would apply to even water. It would apply to everything.
You're talking about the polluter pays principle. To what extent is that implemented in Hong Kong?
Now, I can tell you one good example. In our water bills, whether people actually notice it or not, we have a sewage charge on it, right? Because all the water we use will eventually turn into sewage. And these sewage have to be treated. So everybody, according to the amount of water they use, they'll be charged. So this is one good example of polluters pay principle. And the one in the pipeline is on the waste charging. This is again very controversial, but I think it has to go because waste charging in other countries like Taipei is going very well. And now we have a minor example of this is the plastic bag levy. If you go and buy some food and put it in a plastic, they charge you $50 for each plastic bag you use. So we're gonna extend it to every plastic bag use. And then later on, we will have a more extensive plan to charge on every kind of waste, like Taipei and Tokyo.
You come to Macau on a regular basis.
Yes,
what's your take on the way Macau is tackling this issue of poor air quality?
Well, I would say Macau is an affluent city. By affluent, I mean they're very well off. It may not necessarily be a negative term, but they're well off. And in a way, they could be quite wasteful, in a way. If I was in Macau last week, and then at nighttime when I walk out in the city center, I can see all these neon lights and so on. So I think the light pollution problem is very serious in Macau, and the roadside air quality would have to be remediated a lot. I think the taxis are not run on LPG at the moment, as I gather. In Hong Kong, 100% of taxis running on the road are now on LPG. So maybe Macau can mirror on this policy and try to take a step first on taking the taxis. I wouldn't say it would improve overnight because there's a lot of discussions going on, and I think Macau now is having more public participation in these issues. And as the way goes, every kind of stakeholder will have their views. Obviously, the taxi owners or the people on the streets, they would have their different opinions. So it would take time. But I think this is one of the things we should go on first.
At the very beginning of our talk, I was talking about the air quality readings, and one of the problems has to do with pollutants coming from mainland China being trapped by the lack of airflow. And this problem is particularly serious in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
How to solve that?
Well, we call this the regional smog problem. By smog, we mean smoke and fog, and obviously the pollutant in these smog is more than we would hope for. And I think to solve this problem could be quite complicated. Now, we are one country, we have two systems, but I think the way to go is to have regional collaboration, not just Hong Kong, but we'll take Hong Kong, China, and Macau as a whole, as a region.
Is that taking place? Can you see coordination and cooperation among the authorities, let's say, for instance, in the Pearl River Delta region, Guangdong, Macau, and Hong Kong?
Well, they're constantly talking to each other. Like Hong Kong, they're constantly talking to the Guangdong government to set up some plans, collaboration, exchange of data, and so on. But there is no formal agreement at the moment. We have SIPA for the economic collaboration.
Which is the closer economic partnership agreement. The E stands for economic.
Yeah,
I guess you'd like to see something like the E standing for environment.
Environment, that's true.
Would that be doable? Do you think we could get there?
Well, because as economy grows, inevitably, the environment will be influenced. I use the word influence, more neutral word. I think the government will be deteriorated due to economic growth. That's a fact. I don't think anybody will argue against that. Take the Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macau bridge. Now, you have more traffic. You have more trucks and cars on the road. Do we realize, do we really think that this increased transport volume will not have an effect on the air quality?
Well, what you're saying brings me precisely to the next topic of our talk, which is the Hong Kong-Macau-Zhuhai bridge.
Yeah.
Do we really need this bridge?
Well, for economic reasons, I think there's a very sound reason for doing it. But I think the whole debate is not on whether this bridge is needed.
But it's there. It's being
built.
Yeah, sure.
That's beyond the question. It's gone through all the procedure and so on.
Now let's talk about the impact.
Yeah, let's talk about the impact. I think, Jose, you must be aware of the controversies related to this Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macau bridge on Hong Kong side.
Yes.
Right? There's less controversy on the Macau and less controversy on the China side, but there's a very big controversy on the Hong Kong side. You should know that there's one elderly woman called Ms. Chu, and she actually held a judicial review over the decision accepting the EIA report.
EIA stands for Environmental Impact Assessment,
yes. Report. And her argument, she had 7 points on the judicial review. And of course, the judge only accepted her 7th point, which is the consultant for this project, which is a government project, did not conduct a baseline survey on the air quality, which means what would be the air quality like without the bridge. They have conducted the simulation, the modeling for the air quality with the bridge. But what they haven't done is what would be the air quality like without the bridge. And the judge then accepted this. But then the government appealed. And in that appeal, the government won the appeal. Based on what? Because the judge said, if we interpret the EIO, which stands for the Environmental Impact Assessment Ordinance, there is one thing, it has to have a baseline survey, but the project has also be timely. Which means if the project does not get on now, then there's a lot of damage to all parties. And it's all getting very political because at the end of the day, the elderly women just stopped appealing because there's a group of construction workers that's saying you are damaging our living because we don't have work to do because the contract's been stopped. So I would say whether it's air quality or other things, environmental issues, at the end of the day, there must be a political dimension to it and also a social dimension to these things. And I think all decisions made are very much based on the current social and political dimensions.
So one could ask, so what's the use of commissioning environmental impact assessment reports if at the end of the day the construction will take place despite any injunction or any critical remark within the report?
Right. Well, Hussein, let me put it in very simple terms here, because if I go into details, then maybe the audience would understand most of the things I talked about. But by the environmental impact assessments, we have taken a strong sustainability approach, which means we have three basic approaches to environmental impact assessment. The first one is avoidance. We avoid having impact to the environment, which sometimes necessarily means we have to exhaust all the alternatives. Whether we built it here, built it there, or built it somewhere else, you have to exhaust the alternatives, which of course sometimes is not practicable, but you just can't exhaust every alternatives. And the second thing is, if you have to get the development go ahead, you have to minimize the impact. Minimization is the second term. And then if you cannot minimize it, then you have to have mitigation measures. So this is the principle of the environmental impact assessment based on a strong sustainability approach. But the thing is, how are you going to interpret this environmental impact assessment ordinance? That's where the controversy is. It depends very much on your role, whether you're a Green Party, whether you're an NGO, if you are the government, if you are even just a resident within the area. You have different views on it. But at the end of the day, who decides whether to accept the report or not? It's the director of the Environmental Protection Department. And this is a government project.
So that's why I say, at the end of the day, it's always a political decision.
Mostly.
Mostly. At least most of the times. I came across this report by a Hong Kong NGO called Civic Exchange.
Yes, that's right.
And I'm going to quote from their paper, saying that the environmental impact assessment process in Hong Kong has been left disorientated by the Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macau Bridge case. Would you subscribe this remark?
Disorientated?
Yes.
Well, what I would see from that quote is, and I think they said the government have a conflict in the roles because they would interpret the EIO the way they see fit. That's the way I interpret this sentence. But actually, it's partly true. That's my own opinion, because it's not the government itself who solely makes the decision. They would be advised by an independent committee called the Advisory Council on the Environment, in which I'm also a member. So I can tell you the way it works. We have to look at all the EI reports that we would see to have significant environmental impact, and we have different people representing different sectors in the committee, and we'll be commenting on that, and then we'll consider the public opinions on the project and on the EI report as well. And we would advise the Director of the Environmental Protection, and at the end, she will make a judgment on whether to accept the EI report or not, based on our advice and on the public opinion and so on. Well, there were examples where the environmental permit was rejected based on public comments, based on NGO comments, and that is the Lok Ma Chau spur line, as you have heard, must have heard about.
You're talking about the public citizens.
Yeah.
If they really have a say,
Well,
what's the weight, so to say, of their opinion when you're going through all these?
Right.
You have the report, and you have citizens' opinions. Then you have to take into account you, or at least the government has to take into account the different sides and the overall benefit for the region.
Right.
What's the weight of their say?
Now, at the current practices like this, within the whole environmental impact assessment process, there are two stages where the public would have a chance to comment on the EIA project. The first is when they have a briefing with a brief for the study. They can comment on the brief of the study, on the scope of the study. And then after the EIA report is submitted, they would have a time period to look at the report on the internet at some specified places, and then they input and their public comments, they file their comments to the government. And as I said, the Advisory Council on the Environment would consider these comments in their meetings and would convey these together with their own opinions to the Director of Environmental Protection. And at the present moment, this is the two stages where the public would have input into EIA.
This has to do with the issue of empowerment.
That's right.
You are also the chairman of a Hong Kong-based NGO called Green Power.
Yes.
So you've been looking into the citizens' awareness and involvement in environmental issues. What's your assessment of this current situation in Hong Kong and also in Macau? Do people really feel that they have a say and they are part of so-called governance on environment?
Well, I mean, let me give you a little background on the academic basis of this empowerment thing. According to researchers internationally, I think they think that people's behavior, the way they act, would be influenced by their knowledge, right, about the subject or about the topic. And also that would also influence their attitude towards the thing. So in a way, my belief is people would have to know what is going on. For example, for the Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macau Bridge, how many of Hong Kong's people would know exactly what's going on? I would wonder.
Because there are many technical aspects and many technical issues, so they wouldn't be capable of putting forth an opinion on a certain issue.
That's right. So at the moment, we are looking at a review of the current EIAO practice. There's one thing that we looked at is because they only provided the English summary. They haven't got the Chinese summary. So I think in a way, if they produce the Chinese summary of the projects, I think that would help a bit. And the second thing is, at the present moment, social impact analysis is not a mandatory process for the EIA report. And I think this is very important. Although some of the proponents now are conducting a social impact assessment on their own accord, just because they don't want to have a very strong public resistance at the end of the road of the project. So they would do it that way. And that's part of the empowerment process.
So we're talking about social impact assessment. What are we talking about? Jobs, for the number of job opportunities that will be created, or something broader?
Right. Let me put it in more simple terms. By social impact assessment, they would assess what would be the public's opinion on this project. They would involve going into the community, actually to talk to these people and explain the project to these people. And this is a project used worldwide in order to solve the problem of people lacking knowledge and understanding of the project. Because most of the EIA projects are very much community-based. If you're building a road, building a highway into a certain area, and that community would have to know what's going on before they can make their own minds up whether they think it's feasible. whether it should be built here, or there. So that's what I'm talking about. That's social impact assessment. In a way, you're trying to ease out people's discomfort.
Coming back to the issue of regional cooperation, do you think there should be some sort of a common ground when it comes to the different environmental impact assessment reports criteria across the Delta, meaning in Hong Kong, Macau, and Guangdong, or in mainland China?
Well, at the moment, Hong Kong has its own system. Hong Kong has its own environmental impact assessment ordinance. China has its own law on EIA. And Macau, as far as I know, they haven't got the EIA yet, the ordinance yet. And I think in order to have a common playing field for everybody, I think we need to have some sort of common framework for the EIO. It's not easy, believe me, but we have to start somewhere.
I mean the environmental impact assessment ordinance.
Yeah, I think we need to have some common ground, at least on the process itself. Whether we involve public involvement and in what form of public involvement. And I think Macau, the most immediate thing that Macau has to think about is to establish the EIO first. They need to have an ordinance to work under. Otherwise, if you have an EIA report coming into the government, what sort of criteria do they have to accept it or not?
Okay, towards the end of our talk, I'd like you to talk a little bit about mainland China. We are talking about the Pearl River Delta region, right. Of course. We're talking about Guangdong province, which used to be called the workshop of the world. How do you see the central government's approach when it comes to trying to minimize the issue of air pollution?
Well, I mean, Jose, we are now venturing into an area where it starts very much from the Kyoto Protocol, right? We all know Kyoto Protocol ends at the end of 2012, and now it's extending at least into 2019. And I think the main argument in Copenhagen, which is the COP17, COP15, which is the Conference of the Parties, is the developed countries like America and the developing countries like China and India. These are two very special countries as far as carbon emission is concerned. Now, for total carbon emission, US, China, and India. China is now #1 from 2006. For total carbon emission, China is #1, right? America is #2, and now India is #3. So, in the Kyoto Protocol, I think the main argument is the developing countries are looking on to the developed countries to help them to solve the problems by technology transfer or other means. But the developed countries would think, now these developing countries are not really developing countries. Their carbon emissions are so high, so would they like to have a cap?
But if you look at that on a per capita basis, it's not that high.
No, China is still not #1 per capita basis because of the huge population in China.
That would be the argument from the Beijing side and also New Delhi, right?
Well, that's the first argument. I think the Wu Jintao, main argument of Wu Jintao, one of the main argument is China has been poor for so long.
Yes.
Now
it's our turn to do not kick out the ladder.
Exactly.
Something like that. You've been through this during your industrialization, and now it's our turn.
Yeah.
That's the kind of approach,
that's the
right?
kind of argument. They're arguing on the justice, the global justice basis. You have been polluting the environment for so long. You've been enjoying an affluent lifestyle for so long, and now we're just beginning to have a better life. Would we be justified to have a little bit of a comfort before we be capped on the carbon emission?
But on the other side of the argument, then European countries would say, and other countries would say, yes, but that is not sustainable at all, especially if you're talking about a country like China or a country like India. We're talking about 1 billion plus people living in those countries.
Yes, that's right.
So where should we stand?
Well, I think the main argument in the Kyoto Protocol is because the so-called developing countries are not being capped on their carbon emissions, and the developed countries are being capped on their carbon emissions. Now, that's a trick here. And after that, the developed countries will move their highly polluting industries into these developing countries. So that brings a question. Who is being accountable?
Yes.
The consumer of the services or goods, or the producer? The producer is the developing countries. Very simple. If you make a pair of Nike shoes, would the people in India or developing country will be well off enough to buy those pair of shoes? Of course not. They will be sold maybe back in America, and these are the consumers, right? So who is actually accountable?
So you're talking about shared responsibility
and
because there's a great deal of interdependence. Is that your point?
Yeah, that's right. That's the main argument and the fact that we are now still extending Kyoto Protocol is because everybody gave a little bit of concession. China said, yes, we'll be willing to be capped after a number of years. And the USA would say, well, I will help you out on technology transfer to solve your pollution problems. So that is why they would have say. So this experience tells us one thing. If you want to solve any problem, not just environmental problem, everybody has to give a little bit of concession. If you stand firm, I don't think anything will go. And it actually would be a good model for Hong Kong, Macau, and mainland China to actually collaborate on this regional air pollution problem.
Eric Chang, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And to you at home, thank you all for watching. We'll be back next week with another guest.